Boots pounded against the polished floors of Japan's Imperial Palace as the rebels forced their way inside. They tore through the corridors, detaining officials, severing phone lines, and scouring every room. Somewhere in the palace were 2 vinyl records that held Japan's fate. Emperor Hirohito's recorded surrender message. They had to destroy them. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ashes. The devastation was complete, unprecedented. Inside the Imperial Palace, these men believed Japan could still fight. But what the rebels didn't know, what almost no one in Japan knew, was that there was already really no other possible outcome. Whether the records were broadcast or destroyed, it didn't matter. The country would submit one way or another. Third shot was on its way to Japan. The war that wouldn't end. On May 7th, 1945, inside a schoolhouse in Rouen, France, Nazi officials signed Germany's unconditional surrender. Hitler's empire had collapsed. The Axis alliance lay broken. Mussolini's Italy had surrendered nearly 2 years earlier, and now Germany had fallen. Only Japan remained, its empire crumbling at the edges, but still defiant. The Japanese Empire was no longer the power that had once terrorized the Pacific. The Imperial Navy was nearly collapsing. Its fleets lay beneath the waves after the battles of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Their dwindling air power had resorted to kamikaze assaults. Over 1,500 planes had dived toward their doom in Okinawa alone. In July 1945, a war council decided Japan's fate. President Harry S. Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin gathered in Potsdam, Germany. Their message to Japan was severe: surrender immediately or face total destruction. Japanese leadership chose war. What they didn't know, what only a handful of men in the world understood, was that Truman's warning was not bluffing. Just days earlier, deep in the New Mexico desert, the United States had unlocked a new weapon. On July 16, 1945, the sky above the Jornada del Muerto desert erupted into daylight. A fireball yielding 18.6 kilotons of TNT expanded into a sphere of radioactive heat. The first atomic bomb had just detonated. Truman received the news while still in Potsdam and informed his colleagues of the potential to unleash these atomic warheads against Japan. The president recalled the moment in his memoirs, quote, "There was unanimous, automatic, unquestioned agreement around our table. Never did I hear the slightest suggestion that we do otherwise." For the first time in history, a single weapon could end a war. On August 6, 1945, residents of Hiroshima were starting their day when the sound of a lone aircraft cut through the morning sky. Above, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay flew across the city. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. From 31,000 feet, a steel-cased device plummeted toward the town below. Its name was Little Boy. At 1,800 feet above Hiroshima, the bomb exploded. A flash of white light consumed the city. The detonation ripped through the town at 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, instantly incinerating anything in its wake. Buildings disintegrated. Glass melted. The shockwave tore through Hiroshima at 626 miles per hour, flattening 5 square miles in the blink of an eye. By the time the mushroom cloud reached the stratosphere, at least 60,000 lives had been erased. Tens of thousands more would succumb to burns, radiation sickness, and unimaginable suffering in the months to come. As the nation reeled from the horror of the attack, Truman issued a final message, quote, "The Japanese have seen what our atomic bomb can do. They can foresee what it will do in the future. The Hiroshima attack is only a warning of things to come. If Japan does not surrender, more bombs will have to be dropped." Yet Tokyo refused to bow. The second strike. Japanese military commanders refused to believe that the United States possessed more atomic bombs. Admiral Soemu Toyoda dismissed that their adversaries could engage in an extensive nuclear campaign, declaring, quote, "There would be more destruction, but the war would go on." The Americans proved him wrong. At 3:47 a.m. on August 9, 1945, a second B-29 bomber, Boxcar, lifted off from Tinian Island, carrying an even more powerful nuclear weapon, Fat Man. The primary target was Kokura, an ancient town now part of modern Kita Kyushu. Below, thousands of civilians began their days, unaware that their city had been marked for total annihilation. Thick clouds and smoke from previous firebombings obscured Kokura as Boxcar approached. Major Charles Sweeney circled for 50 minutes, seeking visual confirmation, his orders prohibiting radar targeting. With Japanese anti-aircraft fire intensifying and fuel levels critical, Sweeney made his decision. The bomber banked sharply, setting course for its second target, Nagasaki. At 11:01 a.m., as Boxcar neared its new target, a sudden break in the clouds revealed the Mitsubishi war factories. Seconds later, the payload was released. Fat Man detonated at 1,650 feet above a tennis court in the Urakami Valley. The surrounding hills contained the blast, sparing portions of Nagasaki from complete annihilation. For those within the fireball's reach, however, there was no escape. By year's end, the explosion had claimed between 60,000 and 80,000 lives. With a second city in ruins, Japan still wavered. Government officials fought among themselves. Peace advocates clashed with military hardliners who demanded fighting until the last Japanese citizen perished. Then came the final blow. Hours after Nagasaki's devastation, the Soviet Union declared war. Red Army forces flooded across the Manchurian border, crushing Japanese defenses. Suddenly trapped between American bombs and Soviet tanks, Japan's Supreme War Council reached its verdict. Surrender was the only option, but not everyone agreed. The incident. The night before Japan was to announce its surrender, a group of hardline military officials made their move. Armed and willing to risk everything, they set out to seize the Imperial Palace, silence the Emperor, and keep Japan in the fight, no matter the cost. Leading the coup were Major Kenji Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shiizaki, fanatics from the Army Ministry who refused to accept surrender. They infiltrated the Imperial Palace, approaching the Imperial Guards and attempting to convince them to seal the palace, claiming that an unspecified enemy was coming after the Emperor. But Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, the commander of the palace's guards, refused to be part of the coup. He was the last obstacle standing in their way, and they knew it. Without hesitation, they pulled their pistols and executed him on the spot. Hatanaka grabbed the general's seal. With it, they forged an official order, commanding the palace guards to seal off all communications. The Imperial Palace had suddenly become a prison. Earlier that day, Emperor Hirohito had recorded his surrender speech. 2 vinyl records now held the fate of the nation. If the rebels could find and destroy them, the world would never hear the Emperor's words, and the war would continue. The search began. Guards were disarmed, and rooms were torn apart. The rebels scoured the palace, overturning furniture, ripping through storage rooms, and threatening officials. Time was slipping away, and the future of Japan hung in the balance. While the coup unfolded in the palace, another group of conspirators carried out a simultaneous operation, eliminating Japan's Prime Minister, Kantaro Suzuki. A squad of assassins stormed his office. With machine guns blazing, they riddled the room with bullets, but the Prime Minister was gone. Moments before their arrival, Suzuki had learned of the plot and slipped away. Furious at their failure, the rebels set fire to his home and vanished into the city. The largest invasion that never was. With no official call to cease hostilities, the United States and its allies would have had no choice but to force Japan into submission by any means necessary. Before atomic bombs began raining over Japanese cities, the Allies had been preparing for a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. It would make D-Day seem like a mere rehearsal by comparison. Operation Downfall was designed to be the largest amphibious invasion in human history. It would have mobilized an armada of 24 battleships, 42 aircraft carriers, and over 400 destroyers, assembling the most powerful fleet ever seen. The invasion was split into 2 phases. First, Operation Olympic would see the U.S. Sixth Army storming the shores of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, with 14 battle divisions. These men would be tasked with securing air bases that would serve as the launching ground for the next wave. Then, Operation Coronet would commence, a direct thrust toward the main Japanese island. Allied troops were set to pour onto the beaches of Honshu to capture Tokyo. But anticipating this final battle, Japan had already crafted its counteroffensive. Operation Ketsugo. The strategy was simple, yet brutal. Japanese officials knew they could not win outright, but they could make the cost of victory so unbearable that the Allies might abandon their invasion altogether. Unlike the cautious German forces at Normandy, Japan would not hold anything in reserve. Every available soldier would be thrown into the fray, and even civilians would be weaponized. In Okinawa, Japanese officers had ordered civilians who weren't capable of fighting to take their own lives rather than fall into American hands. That same fate would await the people of Japan's main islands. Entire towns would become strongholds, and their citizens would either fight or perish in kamikaze attacks to defend their homeland. The Japanese were planning on what they called the glorious death of 100 million, ensuring every remaining civilian sacrificed themselves if necessary to protect the emperor from the Allies. American military planners braced for casualties nearing 1 million. But everything changed after the Americans unlocked the lethal power of nuclear weapons. Now, the US had the ability to inflict unimaginable damage on the enemy without having to sacrifice thousands of American soldiers. If Japan didn't surrender, Operation Downfall was no longer the only route toward victory. A prolonged nuclear campaign was also on the table. The third bomb. In mid-1945, the United States had enough fissile material to produce 3 nuclear bombs. Gadget, the first, had already been detonated in the Trinity test. The second and third, Little Boy and Fat Man, had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But even after those 2 strikes, U.S. officials believed Japan might still refuse to surrender. Major General Leslie R. Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, was convinced that another atomic strike would be necessary to break Japan's resolve, and the United States had the means to deliver it. U.S. scientists were nearing completion of another nuclear device, adeptly known as the third shot. This would be similar to the bomb used over Nagasaki, a plutonium-239 explosive based on Fat Man's design. Military planners expected to ship the final components to assemble the third shot by August 12th or 13th, with the bomb ready for deployment sometime in mid to late August. A third city, its name yet to be decided, could soon share the fate of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While no official target had been named, the criteria had already been established. According to U.S. officials, the bomb should be dropped on, quote, large urban areas of not less than 3 miles in diameter, existing in the larger populated areas, between the Japanese cities of Tokyo and Nagasaki, and should have high strategic value. The original target shortlist included 5 significant cities: Hiroshima, Kyoto, Yokohama, Kokura, and Niigata. Hiroshima had already been obliterated. Despite being one of the largest untouched cities, Kyoto was spared after Secretary of War Henry Stimson personally intervened, citing its immense cultural and historical significance. That left 3 primary targets: Yokohama, Kokura, and Niigata. Each was a vital industrial center, packed with factories producing weapons, aircraft, and other military necessities. Some U.S. officials suggested an even more drastic approach, targeting Tokyo itself. A direct strike on the heart of Japan's government could shatter the country's morale entirely and finally force it into submission. But before these discussions went any further, President Truman issued a direct order to Major General Groves, quote, "The third bomb is not to be released over Japan without express authority from the President." Some believe it was the scale of destruction from the first nuclear bombs that had started to make Truman uneasy about carrying on with the U.S.'s nuclear campaign. His Secretary of Commerce, Henry Wallace, recorded in his diary that during a cabinet meeting, the President expressed, quote, "The thought of wiping out another 100,000 people was too horrible." But the Manhattan Project continued producing nuclear weapons at a rapid pace. If Japan refused to surrender, the bombs would keep falling. The nuclear campaign. There's no indication in official records that U.S. military leaders were ever bound to a specific number of nuclear deployments over Japan. If Japan refused to bow, there was no telling when or where the atomic campaign would stop. According to Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot who dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima, the U.S. had another 15 bombers and crews standing by, fully prepared to continue deploying atomic weapons. He estimated it would take as many as 5 nuclear strikes before Japan would capitulate. A telephone transcript from August 13, 1945, between General John E. Hull, a key strategist in the Pacific Theater, and Colonel L.E. Seaman, General Grove's assistant, provides evidence of how far the nuclear campaign might have gone. The two men explicitly discussed the deployment of a third bomb, then a fourth, a fifth, and beyond. There was talk of up to 7 atomic bombs being dropped by the end of October. These were not arbitrary numbers. The U.S. had the means to sustain a prolonged atomic assault. American factories could streamline nuclear bomb production, churning out fissile material fast enough to assemble 3.5 bombs a month. If Japan held out, cities that had once been considered possible targets would have become definitive ones. Kawasaki, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, Kure, Yamata, Kokura, Shimonoseki, Yamaguchi, Kumamoto, Fukuoka, Nagasaki, and Sasebo, each one erased from the map. Even Tokyo wouldn't have been spared, taking out Japan's most powerful officials, military commanders, even the emperor himself, throwing out any hope of an organized surrender. The casualty toll would have been staggering, far exceeding the already horrifying projections of Operation Downfall. Millions of lives lost, and any remains of Japan's society, its cities, its culture, its people, gone forever. On the Soviet front, as Japan braced for the next nuclear strike, they were still locked in battle with the Red Army surging from the Western Front, crushing their last stronghold on the continent. Within hours, the Red Army surged across the Manchurian border, and a wave of tanks, artillery, and infantry smashed into Japan's last stronghold on the Asian mainland. Japan's puppet states, including Manchukuo, Xinjiang, and northern Korea, crumbled almost overnight. The Kwantung Army, Japan's largest force outside the home islands, fought as hard as it could, throwing every available weapon at hand, including waves of kamikaze planes diving down to halt the Soviet advance. But it was no use. The Soviets destroyed entire battalions and gutted Japan's industrial heartland in a matter of days. Had Japan's leaders chosen to prolong the war, the Soviets could have marched into Tokyo before 1945 ended, just as they had torn through Berlin mere months prior. The battle for the capital would have been a bloodbath, with Japanese troops and civilians fighting to the bitter end. But against two overwhelming enemies fighting from opposite ends of the Pacific, Japan's fate would have been sealed. The consequences would have changed the course of history. A potential Soviet occupation of half of Japan, perhaps all of Tokyo, or even the northern home islands, would have redrawn the Cold War map entirely. Just as Germany and Korea were split, so too could Japan have been cleaved in two, a communist north under Soviet control and a capitalist south under American occupation. Tokyo might have become another Berlin, a divided city. Such a scenario could have likely pushed the US and the Soviet Union into a full-scale confrontation. With American naval dominance cutting off Soviet supply lines, Washington might have tried to force the Soviets out, triggering an armed standoff, or worse, a Third World War, starting in Japan. Surrender. But while armies and cities fell across the nation, there were still those determined to keep on fighting, regardless of the consequences. Inside the Imperial Palace, rebels kept on searching for the Emperor's surrender message, hoping to silence it before the world could hear. With swords drawn and firearms at the ready, they tore through the palace's corridors, seizing officials and cutting telephone lines as they searched for the vinyl recordings containing Emperor Hirohito's message of surrender. But the records were nowhere to be found. Anticipating an attempt to silence the Emperor's voice, Loyalist officials had hidden the recordings in a chamber beneath the palace. As dawn approached, General Shizuichi Tanaka, the Eastern District Army commander, arrived to confront the rebels. His stern presence filled the room as he reprimanded the officers for their defiance. Their actions, he declared, were a direct betrayal of the Emperor's will. Faced with the harsh reality that their cause had unraveled and that victory was slipping from their grasp, the rebels began to abandon the fight. By 8 a.m., the coup had completely collapsed. Loyalist forces regained control of the palace. What nearly became Japan's final act of defiance had failed. But Major Kenji Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shiizaki, two of the coup's ringleaders, refused to surrender. Hatanaka rode through the streets of Tokyo on a motorcycle, while Shiizaki rode on horseback. Their desperate mission was now reduced to tossing leaflets to explain their failed uprising. As the city stirred awake, The streets were littered with the final words of men who had tried to alter the course of history and failed. By mid-morning, Hatanaka and Shiizaki had reached their end. Both men took their lives. Hatanaka left behind a final poem. His last words, quote, "I have nothing to regret now that the dark clouds have disappeared from the reign of the Emperor." Meanwhile, across Japan, the moment that would change everything arrived. Public broadcaster NHK announced that the Emperor would soon address the nation. For the first time in history, the people of Japan would hear the voice of their divine ruler. Families in homes across the country sat in formal attire, their faces solemn as they gathered around their radios. What was to come would define their future. Then, at precisely noon, the national anthem played. The crackle of the radio faded, and then Hirohito's voice rang out. His message was absolute, quote, "Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization." 2 weeks later, on September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally signed its surrender, and World War II officially ended. The world was spared from more years of battle, narrowly avoiding further nuclear devastation and a drastically different world order. The Demon Corps. With Japan's surrender, nuclear weapon production came to an abrupt halt. The third shot was never completed. Its remaining plutonium core, codenamed Rufus, was then transferred to Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico for further experimentation. But even with the war over, this core would still claim lives. On August 21st, 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian was conducting an experiment when he dropped a tungsten carbide brick onto the core by mistake, making Rufus go supercritical and unleashing a burst of radiation. Though Daghlian swiftly knocked the brick away, the damage was done. He succumbed to radiation poisoning 25 days later. 9 months after, physicist Louis Slotin was performing a similar experiment, delicately balancing 2 beryllium hemispheres around the core, with only a screwdriver preventing them from snapping shut. Then, the screwdriver slipped, and the hemispheres clamped down, sealing the core in a fleeting flash of blue light. Slotin instinctively flung the hemispheres apart, saving his colleagues, but dooming himself. He passed away 9 days later. After these 2 accidents, the core was renamed the Demon Corps. Any plans to use it for further nuclear testing were abandoned. Instead, it was melted down and repurposed for other warheads, putting an end to the last atomic weapon, designed to fall over Japan.